The fear was tremendous and deep throughout the entire community.
It's incredibly unusual for a serial killer simply to stop killing.
The serial killer is the Olympiad of the pathological liar.
Why are we fascinated with serial killers? It's not like we agree with what they did, or like we understand their point of view. In fact, it's quite the opposite. They're so far away from what we consider normal, good, or understandable that we're simply intrigued by this. We want to know how a person can be so different from us, yet how they can hide among everyone else for years. For a serial killer to become serial, they must learn to dodge the law quite well, and this makes them particularly scary. But sometimes their confessions are the scariest. You can finally see them for who they truly are: psychopathic monsters who take great pride in their work. In 2001, Gary Ridgway confessed to taking the lives of 49 women. He had escaped the police for 2 decades and had had 3 wives, completely unaware of his second life. A few decades earlier, Dennis Rader would send letters to the police describing in great detail all of the gruesome ways that he would torment his victims. Still, it took the police over 30 years to arrest him. His final confession was truly horrifying. And when Israel Keyes confessed to his crimes in 2012, he said,
"Back when I was smart, I would let them come to me."
And trust me, it gets even creepier. Without further ado, let's dive into the serial killer confessions that'll leave you with chills. Today's first story begins in the 1980s in a dodgy part of SeaTac, Washington.
This area back in the early 80s had a very transient population. There were topless bars over here. There were a lot of hotels where you could rent rooms for an hour or 2.
This is the area that Detective Faye Brooks worked at the time, trying hard to solve the piling crimes. The targets would always be young call girls. Unfortunately, they're often the most vulnerable.
A lot of the young girls had grown up in abusive homes, and that was why they were running away. And I could relate to that. I'm a survivor of child abuse, and there, but for the grace of God, were I. And so I could certainly empathize with them, and I also wanted to help them.
One of Faye's first proteges was Marcia Chapman, a 31-year-old mother of 3 who had resorted to this line of work out of desperation for money. She had been the victim of a horrendous violation, and Faye was trying to get to the bottom of the story. But unfortunately, the story was just unraveling, and it would get much darker. In 1982, a man sailing his boat on the Green River saw what he thought were 2 mannequins, but they turned out to be human bodies, not far away from the Strip, the area Faye worked in to protect the female workers.
Well, one of the victims in the water, her hand was just waving with the current of the water. And it was like, "Here I am, please help me." But of course, it was too late.
Within hours, the SeaTac police were searching the river and its banks for more bodies. Unfortunately, their hunches were well-founded. They soon found a 3rd body. All 3 victims had been identified as young women who were working on the Strip: Wendy Lee Caulfield, Giselle Ann Lavorne, and Marcia Chapman. This was when the FBI got involved. Clearly, they were hunting a serial killer with a clear MO.
The organized offender was more planned, more premeditated, was able to conceptualize crimes and carry them out very efficiently, mainly because of the fact that they had very little feeling for another human being. They looked at a victim as an object for their excitement. Basically, you're talking about a sexual psychopath.
The worst kind, and they were on a killing spree. By the fall of that year, 2 more bodies had been discovered. Also young illegal workers, also dumped in the Green River area. Then several more girls went missing, with no bodies turning up, and the police were simply at a loss. They knew the Strip would be, for lack of a better word, a good hunting ground for any psycho killer. But they had no idea who the culprit could be, so the only thing they could do was stalk the Strip's motels, hoping the perpetrator would try and strike again.
This was the area that I was working in. This is the area where the bulk of the Green River victims were picked up from. And we would sit here and look, trying to identify who might be the suspect. We had very dedicated detectives who were determined to solve this case.
By September 26th, a 10th victim went missing, 16-year-old Linda Jane Rule.
Linda Rule was a slender blonde girl who lived up in the North End. She had been working the streets, and she had a boyfriend who kind of served as a pimp.
Yeah, these girls were already as unlucky as they could be. Now their lives would be taken away faster than any police officer could react. Just in 1982, 15 girls were killed. With nothing but promises from the police, people started creating their own stories about the Green River Killer.
There was rampant speculation that it might be even a law enforcement officer because of the easy access that the individual had to the number and variety of women in the community.
Imagine being a street worker during that time. This is never a safe job, but in SeaTac in the 1980s, it was anyone's worst nightmare. As the police continued to stalk the area, in April 1983, they spotted a woman getting abducted, Maria Melvar. She was having lunch with her boyfriend inside a small cafe. He went outside to make a phone call, and when he came back in, Maria wasn't there. He then realized she was put inside a truck and driven away by a man.
There was a man driving, and then she was talking to the man, and so he determined to follow the truck because he wasn't sure what was going on. He worried about her. And they got up to the stoplight at Highway 99 and 216th. But when he turned left, he couldn't see the car.
He didn't call the police at first. Instead, he took his family and drove through the whole area around the strip, looking for the blue truck. Finally, they found it, parked in front of a tiny home. That's when he rang up the police and asked them to search this man's house. When an officer rang the house's doorbell, a man answered, Gary Ridgway. There was nothing strange about him. In fact, he seemed like quite a nice guy. The officer simply asked if there was anybody inside the house with him, and he simply answered no. Somehow, this was enough for the officer to say thank you and leave. Following this, Gary Ridgway would take at least another 40 lives.
All serial killers have the ability to appear so normal that they throw off even people who are considered experts. The serial killer is the Olympiad of the pathological liar.
By June 1983, 26 girls were missing. Tragically, they were all dead. The big problem, apart from the obvious, was that the more murders someone commits, the more efficient they become. Experts knew this, and the police were getting more and more desperate.
The fear was tremendous and deep throughout the entire community.
Even the police officers feared for the lives of those around them. Such a kill count in such a short amount of time was unprecedented. By the spring of 1984, the police had found 40 bodies, most of them simply dumped by the river or in shrubs like objects. All women had been violated and strangled. And then, before the police could do anything about it, the culprit seemed to stop.
It's incredibly unusual for a serial killer simply to stop killing. A serial killer will usually only cease murder when he's apprehended or when he dies himself.
What had really happened? Gary Ridgway had started dating Judith Lorraine Lynch. She was a divorced mom and a kind woman who came to like Gary for his kind nature.
When I first met him, I thought he was quite the gentleman and so polite and nice. He loved the country music and the dancing. And he was always smiling. He never got angry. And I just thought he was the greatest. It was like love at first sight.
Judith would go on to become Gary's third wife. In 1969, when he was 20, he married his high school sweetheart, Claudia Craig, but they split up in less than a year after he cheated on her with several illegal workers and contracted STDs. In 1973, he married Marcia Winslow after meeting him at a truck factory where he worked as a painter, but she would divorce him too. Throughout his years with her, Gary became extremely religious, reading the Bible aloud at home and crying for hours after sermons. Still, he saw ladies of the night frequently. This drove Marcia mad, and she broke up with him in 1981. Remember when the killing started? That's right, 1982. Now, in 1985, Judith moved in with Gary.
He offered to help me move and that I could move in with him if I like. There was no carpet in his house, so he let me pick out some carpet. He had previous renters in there. And he had told me that the little one had wet on the carpet.
There was nothing strange about this. 3 years later, the two got married. It was a perfect life for Judith, or so she thought, for 13 years. Indeed, it took until 2001 for the Washington police to arrest Gary Ridgway. And it was all thanks to the advancements in DNA technology. The police had collected DNA samples from the victims, including Marcia Chapman, but at the time they had no way of comparing them against the samples taken from every man questioned. After the turn of the millennium, everything changed.
This is the DNA from Marcia Chapman, and this is the DNA from the Green River Killer. And we looked at them and we're like, they're the same. They're the same. It's Gary Ridgway.
Imagine being the wife of the most notorious serial killer in your country and finding this out when the police came to arrest him. Arresting him wasn't the end. The police knew that they had a huge case on their hands.
He'd been identified as the most prolific serial killer in the history of the United States. Each of us recognized that this would be the biggest criminal case in the history of the state of Washington.
Ridgway was put in an interrogation room, and as you might expect from a prolific psycho killer, he was extremely normal.
How are you? Pretty good.
A quick look at his life showed the same. Very normal guy. Gary Ridgway was born on February 18th, 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah. He grew up with his parents and two brothers. His mom was a pretty strange character.
I always remember her wearing kind of the
really
tight shorts and low cut tops and longer hair.
But that was the least of her problems. Gary would wet the bed well into his teens, and every time his mom would wash his genitals thoroughly.
And so when a mother behaves in a sexualized or hyper-sexualized way, it's very unsettling for an adolescent boy.
His dad was no saint either. He was a bus driver and would take Gary for rides through town. When they would pass illegal street workers, he would complain about them and call them names, but sometimes he would stop the bus and leave Gary inside while he went and had intercourse with them. Imagine growing up with that family. From then on, Gary developed a love-hate relationship with his mom and with illegal female workers. He wanted their services, but he also wanted to take their lives. In 1982, Ridgway was questioned by the police for seeing prostitutes pretty much every single day on the Strip. He even passed a lie detector test about the Green River murders. But that's when the police collected the DNA swab that got him arrested in 2001. The first time he was questioned, Ridgway was adamant that he didn't do anything. He even convinced his wife that he was innocent and that the police had the wrong man. But a few days later, the police linked his DNA to 3 more murders.
Myself and another attorney were in the meeting room waiting for Mr. Ridgway. I don't recall what we were talking about, but we both had smiles on our faces when he walked in. And he said, "Oh, you won't be smiling when we're done. I've been lying to you all. I've been manipulating everyone for all these years. I killed them all."
He knew he was facing the death penalty, so he offered the cops a full breakdown of his horrific crimes in exchange for a life sentence.
When I got through having a climax with her, I jumped on her.
He got his arm around the girl's neck.
How much are you pulling on her neck? I'm pulling really hard on her neck. How? Just like this. What are you saying to her? Don't fight, and I'll let you go.
He would leave their bodies in the woods, and he would return to them to have intercourse with them. But not for long, he said, as flies and maggots would start appearing. Gary Ridgway was convicted of 49 murders, but he confessed to somewhere between 70 and 90 victims. Simply no one matched those numbers. And with a very calm attitude, Ridgway led police officers through the forests and river area where he dumped the bodies. He also explained his view on life to the officers.
He seemed throughout the interviews to try to blame a lot of what had happened on the women in his life.
that the women that he actually killed were kind of an extension of all the women before who had disappointed him in some way.
My releasing vote was killing women.
All of this stopped when he met Judith. Well, almost everything.
Gary would call home and say that, he's going to be late coming home, so he's going to grab a bite to eat, grab a hamburger, and he'll be late. When I think back now, that was probably one time when he was out picking up someone off of the Highway 99 strip.
It's estimated that Ridgway took another 10 lives between 1985 and 2001. At his trial in 2003, he was asked how he pleaded to 48 deaths in a row.
For the death of Mary B. Meehan.
Guilty.
I just sat there and cried, and that's when
Based
it
upon my observations,
finally sunk in that
Ridgway was sentenced to 48 consecutive life sentences. The victims' families all had a chance to speak to him.
I can only hope someone gets the opportunity to choke you unconscious so you can live through the horror that you put our daughters, our sisters, our mothers through.
There was one man that made the Green River Killer cry, Linda's father.
There are people here that hate you. I'm not one of them.
Was very sympathetic, very compassionate individual.
What God says to do, and that's to forgive all. So you are forgiven, sir.
So there is an ounce of emotion inside this monster. Perhaps in this moment he realized what he had done, or maybe he didn't. Perhaps Gary Ridgway grew up in a terrible family, but he had the choice to not be like them. Instead, he was worse. Our next story takes us to Wichita, Kansas, on March 9, 1945. This is when Dennis Lynn Rader was born to parents Dorothea and William. He grew up with his parents and 3 brothers, but his house was rarely a lively place. In fact, he felt deeply neglected by his parents throughout his whole childhood. They would work long hours and see their children once in a blue moon.
His mother worked at a grocery store. His dad worked at the railroad and for a number of years. Very, very nice people. Dennis was very laid back, very quiet.
The brothers raised each other, but for Dennis, it didn't end well.
When he was growing up, one of the things that he mentioned was that he had a very distinct recollection of his grandmother killing chickens, and that he became thrilled with that type of activity.
Dennis spent his spare time trapping and hanging animals. Meanwhile, he had fantasies about taking his mother's life too. Around the same time, he began cross-dressing and stalking the women in his neighborhood. There was one particular moment that announced his transformation. When Dennis was 11, one of his female teachers humiliated him in front of all his classmates. That evening, he went to her house and peeked at her through a window.
And he had rope with him. He tied it around his waist, tied it tight, and as he watched her through the window, he had an orgasm. So now we have the rope very much associated with sexual pleasure as well as with voyeurism and the feeling of being powerful over another person.
It might sound creepy, but it's about to get so much creepier, trust me. By 9th grade, Dennis was sure what he was going to be as an adult, a serial killer. This is one of the drawings he did as a young adult. But he kept his demons well hidden. In 1971, he even married a woman he'd met in college. He was kind, neighborly, and very much normal, as far as those around him knew. Skip to January 15th, 1974. The people of Wichita were in absolute shock at the news of a truly gruesome murder spree.
Murders like this, they happened in New York or on the West Coast or in Europe, but they didn't happen here in the heartland.
A mother, father, and 2 children had been found lifeless inside of their own house. They had been tied up and tortured. And in an even sadder twist, it was the family's older children who found them. They were at school when the murders took place. The police were desperate to catch the culprit, but it would take them 30 years to arrest Dennis Rader. And this only happened because he came forward.
First of all, Mr. Otero, a bag put over his head and strangled. After that, I did Mrs. Otero, and I strangled Josephine while she was down. And then I went over to Junior and put the bag on his head.
A few months after destroying the Otero family, Rader saw a 21-year-old woman, Catherine Bright, picking up her mail outside her home. This was all he needed to decide she was going to be next. So he snuck into her house while she was away and waited for her to come to her death. When she entered her home, she was with her brother Kevin. They were returning from college, but Rader had plans for both. He threatened them with a gun and tied them tightly to chairs. When Kevin got loose, Rader fired at him in the head. Still, somehow he managed to get up and run as Rader was busy impaling Catherine. And again, somehow, the police didn't catch him.
When you look at his early murders, he was lucky because there were mistakes made that he could have been caught first or second one easily.
Kevin could have been a key witness. After all, he'd seen Rader up close. But unfortunately, his brain injury meant that he was unable to remember most of what had happened that awful day. Here's where it gets interesting. Because the police had so little information about the killer, people started rumors. Before long, there was a rumor that 3 men had done the Otero family murders. Dennis couldn't stand that. He wanted credit for his deeds. So he decided to contact the police.
And the way that came to us was through a letter.
He tells the police this is not going to end. He's going to continue to do this. If you don't catch me, more people in this community are going to die.
Dennis signed the letter BTK, an abbreviation for bind, torture, kill. He was proud of his method and wanted the world to know who he was. The officers were afraid, but they simply didn't know who to consider a suspect. So they just waited for the killer to strike again, hoping he wouldn't. In 1977, BTK took the life of Shirley Relford, a 24-year-old single mom. Her children witnessed everything.
The kids were really banging on the door, hollering, screaming. She got sick, threw up, got her a glass of water, comforted her a little bit, and then I went ahead and tied her up and then put a bag over her head and strangled her.
In a pretty outrageous twist, because 3 years had passed, the police didn't even connect this murder to the BTK ones. But when someone else died in December that year, they connected the dots.
Nancy was a single lady, a beautiful young lady who lived alone.
So I went around to the back of the house, cut the phone lines, broke in, and waited for her to come home.
By now, he had perfected his terrifying MO.
What is arousing for somebody like Rader is to prolong the victim's agony because that's what's stimulating to the individual. The definition of sadism is essentially inflicting pain on someone else.
Rader was so proud of his most recent killing that he called the police to report the murder the very next day.
You will find the homicide 43 South Virginia, Nancy Fox.
2 months later, BTK wrote to the KAKE radio station. He confirmed all his murders to the date and wrote a poem mocking Nancy's death. By this, he was mocking the police as well. How were they so unable to arrest him? Rader then got a degree in criminal justice. You heard that right. He wanted to perfect his skills as a serial killer, and he took his time. He would kill again in 1985 after he spotted Marianne Hedge, a 53-year-old woman living 4 houses away from his. He then took her body to Christ Lutheran Church, where he was the president of the council and she was the deacon. He took photos of her in the most horrible positions. In 1986, 28-year-old Vicki Wegrell would be found dead by her husband. And in 1991, 62-year-old Dolores Davis would die. Incredibly, the police were nowhere closer to narrowing down the suspect pool. They were helplessly hoping BTK would get arrested for a petty crime and somehow linked to his crimes. But he wouldn't, nor would he strike again. He became a compliance officer and was a proud dad. That's right, he had had 2 children in the 1970s amidst the killing sprees.
He said that one time back in I think the 70s or the early 80s, when they had put one of his messages on the front page of the paper, that he'd been sitting there at the breakfast table reading the paper, when his wife came up behind and looked over his shoulder and looked down and pointed at it and said, "Look at that. He misspells that word the same way that you do." And Dennis had said, "I thought I was going to have to kill her then, but she didn't say anything more, so I just let it go."
Just like most psychopathic killers, Dennis Rader was extraordinary at manipulating and appearing normal. Skip to 2005, the Wichita Eagle published an article on the 30-year anniversary of the Otero killings. This triggered BTK. He wanted recognition. He started sending the police clues to find the bodies, letters, maps, cereal boxes, and Barbie dolls posed like his victims. He was arrogant and convinced he would never get caught. But he made a mistake. He sent the police an information disk, which they could track to Dennis's computer at Christ Lutheran Church. On February 25th, 2005, BTK was finally arrested. 30 years later, calm as ever, he admitted,
Yes, you guys know. What else?
Say who you are.
He proceeded to talk for over 33 hours, over 2 days in court. He described in great detail everything he had done, as well as why.
Is this something you were doing for your personal pleasure?
Still fantasies, sir.
Rarely is a serial killer so open and truthful about his crimes and motives. BTK was proud, and he was eager to share his life with the world. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences, one for every victim. Our last story takes us up north to Anchorage, Alaska in 2012. 18-year-old Samantha Koenig was just closing up shop at the coffee stand she was working at. Just then, a man wearing a ski mask entered and ordered an Americano. He then pulled a gun at her and told her to turn off the lights. He tied her up and drove her to his house. There, he violated and killed her. He then left her body in his shed and left on a 2-week cruise with his family in the Gulf of Mexico. This was Israel Keyes, and Samantha was his 12th victim. Keyes was born in Utah in 1978 and grew up in a Mormon family. By the age of 20, he'd become a serial rapist. And although still unconfirmed, he is suspected for the murder of 2 girls in Colville in 1996 and 97. This means that he became a serial killer in his teens. But most of Keyes' victims are unidentified. Throughout his life, he moved from state to state, even keeping kill kits hidden in remote locations across the country, just in case he'd be passing through. These contained rope, guns, and means to dispose of the bodies. Back to 2012, when he returned from his trip, Keyes put makeup on Samantha's body, sewed her eyes open with fishing line, and snapped a picture of a 4-day-old issue of the Anchorage Daily News alongside her body, making it look alive. He demanded $30,000 in ransom, then dismembered the body and disposed of it in Montasuka Lake, north of Anchorage. This was his biggest mistake. The police tracked withdrawals from his account and eventually arrested Keyes in Texas on March 13, 2012. He was taken to Alaska and put inside an interrogation room. What followed was a very creepy confession.
Didn't sleep much last night.
Although Keyes was only being investigated for the murder of Samantha Koenig, he confessed to 10 others. He also explained exactly how he operated.
I thought it was smart. I would let them come to me. Just remote area. Come go to a remote area that's not anywhere near where you live, but that other people go to as well.
Indeed, Keyes did not choose the victims as much as he chose locations he thought were the most efficient killing grounds. Just like the Green River Killer and BTK, Keyes seemed proud of his actions and was just curious to see where the police were at.
Where are they at? They find them alive.
Israel Keyes was a killer, violator, burglar, arsonist, and necrophiliac, but he had no remorse about this. In fact, he wanted to share every detail of his sick life with the police and the media. FBI agent Jolene Godin spoke to Keyes over months and months. He simply wasn't done talking about his crimes.
He was very meticulous, he was very organized, he definitely planned everything that he did.
To complete the horror movie, Keyes was unwilling to take any responsibility for his actions. While awaiting trial, he took his own life in his prison cell. He left drawings of 11 skulls, another clue into his 11 murders. Sadly, with Keyes dead, the police are pretty far away from revealing all the identities whose lives Keyes took. It's a sad and worrying thought that he killed for over a decade and no one could track him down or even suspect him as a murderer.
Every serial killer, including, I believe, Mr. Keyes, are not crazy. You cannot be that organized and deliberate and fit any legal definition of insanity.
All the more worrying. While these serial killers were caught, who knows how many more are operating as we speak. Hey, thanks for watching. Be sure to like this video and subscribe for more. Till next time, and stay safe. It's a strange world out there.
Making Waves. This is a story of a close friend and somewhat lover of mine. We've known each other for a long time. I've always trusted her and her mind, even more than my own. But each time she left, she came back different, and I started to doubt. You could say it all goes back 20 years ago, to when Esther first decided she had to go to South America. She heard about a barely contacted tribe that was threatened by the logging industry. No study of any kind existed on them. She just landed associate professor and wanted to solidify her position with something big. Everyone told her this tribe wouldn't have anything to do with her. They didn't know how persuasive Esther could be. I think maybe it goes back further, to when she first entered my life. I don't remember how we met, I just remember her suddenly being there. In almost every moment, we just bonded that fast. She was one of those girls who was top of her class, yet still found time for sports and a social life. She was my date to the prom, and while we danced, she swore she'd make a difference.
I'm going to change humanity,
she said.
one mind at a time.
She ran for mayor at 19 and almost won. Then, I went to college to study as a classicist, and she followed behind, majoring in anthropology. I liked classical languages because they worked my brain enough to block certain other things. Dreams I would have, anytime I nodded off, of a pit deep in some forest. Mist billowed out of it like the fog machine in a bad horror movie, and a dark figure was moving. A voice whispered from behind me, "Stop it." When I told Esther about the dreams, she said,
"Oh, that."
She told me I gave my brain too much leisure. Anyway, we both got positions teaching at the same college, and that's when she left for South America. She told me that
Something is calling to me down there. Something in the depths beyond civilization.
she was gone for 5 months, living with this tribe. She returned to America in an almost entranced state. I called her as soon as I knew she was back, but she blew me off. She seemed compelled or driven in some way.
They don't have a written language of their own. Someone has to give them a voice.
Of course, but they didn't give you a deadline, surely.
They don't think like us. I have to get out while I can.
She disappeared for another 2 months and came back with a manuscript. It hit the academic circles like an anvil. Just like that, she could phone in the rest of her career and never have to worry, tenure track and all. In a way, she did phone in the rest of her career. I think she was trying to get something out of her system with that book, and she never quite did. She couldn't escape from what she'd experienced there. She could only keep rehashing it.
They don't have a concept of truth and falsehood as nearly all known civilizations do. History is fluid for them, based on present requirements. Since they have no written language, any facts that do not explain a visible reality are pruned out. For instance, the tribe is divided into 3 major villages. They said it was because the king had 3 sons. Each village member received a village tattoo, a sun, a bird, and a snake. I found an old man with a 4th brand, a fish. I was able to deduce that a 4th village had been destroyed at some point, so the fact that the king had a 4th son was no longer worth remembering. Nobody knows or cares how many sons the king in fact had. The phrase, "in fact," is meaningless to them.
The paragraph alone generated a good many articles from her peers. For me, a later paragraph on the same theme resonated more. I couldn't quite explain why, but as someone who knew Esther intimately, it troubled me.
They said they remembered me from a long time ago. I had developed enough rapport with them now to feel comfortable informing them that they were mistaken, and I had never been to their villages before. They said the old ones remembered me from their youth and that I had gone away for a long time. The youths had been taught about me their whole lives, they said. That they had never seen me before 2 months prior was irrelevant. I was now an accepted part of their lives, so I had to be explained. Even the youths and their parents now remembered being taught about me by the village elders. No one could accuse them of lacking consistency. It is not that they were lying or making it all up. They now believed this version of reality.
I asked her about it when we were able to spend some time together after she'd finished her lecture tour and book signing. I was already feeling more than a little neglected. I tried to understand, but I only got more annoyed when I thought about it. To be honest, it made me more aggressive than I should have been. So, now that you're a civilized woman again, you say these confused savages fabricated memories of you? But, they did let you into their village when they refused contact with any and all other outsiders before. How do you explain that? Perhaps they remembered you all along. She looked more disappointed with me than I'd ever seen her before. And trust me, I can be very disappointing.
Jack, I know what you're doing. You're poking around for nerves. This time, you might hit something critical. Leave it.
Oh, come on. I thought it was solid anthropology. You're right, I'm just poking. Then she started to cry. She hadn't been disappointed with me at all. She was disappointed with herself. I think when you're that disappointed with yourself, it's depression by another name. She'd pushed herself too hard. At the time, I did as she asked, and I just left it. She was never quite the same old Esther again. She always seemed distracted, torn away from the present by some problem she couldn't articulate enough to begin solving. When she spoke in that state, she'd always say things that gave me the creeps. Two, I remember clearly.
Something's happening to me,
she said, with just me and a mutual friend over coffee. She couldn't or wouldn't tell us what she meant. And
none of you are what you think you are,
she muttered, staring into the distance at a colleague's party. Whatever do you mean? Some guy at the party asked. She turned fiercely to the man and told him,
if you could see the way I see, you'd understand. It's all lies.
Needless to say, the invitations to parties and social events dried up, although she seemed to take her isolation very well. Were it not for me and her lecture halls, she wouldn't have had much human contact at all. The few times I visited her, her neighbors asked if she was okay. They told me, Sir, she's taken to talking to someone outside in her yard at nights, always near the electric lines. Nobody else is out there, I'm sure of it. Using a recording device to record ideas or lecture notes isn't strange for an academic, nor is talking to oneself. I justified it, yet it didn't really sit right. One time, when I'd cajoled her into meeting me at some awful Italian restaurant we used to like, she told me,
how sure can you be that I'm Esther and we've met before?
Well, we come here all the time because we know the waitstaff is dreadfully rude. The food is mediocre and the music is the same Whitney Houston CD every time. I said. I felt I knew what she was getting at, and I wasn't in the mood. Her moods had become so spacey by this time.
You trust your memory,
she said, as though I'd said just what she'd wanted me to say.
Our whole sense of reality is based on trust. You remember how I look, how I sound, and match it up with the present. We generalize. We call this a table and a million other things that are completely different objects. And then we aren't even talking about the table. We're talking about an image in our minds. It's all lies.
If I replace the muffler on my car, is it then a completely new car or the same car with a new muffler? I poised to her. Esther, you've had an experience. It changed you, but you're still you. And as your one-man intervention, I'll love you through this.
What about whales?
She asked. Whatever sound a pure question mark is, that's the one I made.
At some point, we all held to the view that everything in the sea is a fish. Fish lay eggs, have scales, cold blood. Then we found whales. They live in the sea, have fins, but they give birth, don't have scales, and are warm-blooded. We're stuck now. Either we expand our definition of a fish to include whales, or we have to admit there's something else in the sea other than fish.
And this fills you with existential angst.
I'm saying you might just be looking at the fish and neglecting the whales.
I'm too glib and self-important to ever be flighty. So hopefully you'll follow me when I say, at that moment, I saw a glimmer of something in her eyes that was something else, from someplace else. I don't know what it was. Maybe I saw the whale. I didn't like it. I'm ashamed to say I stopped making excuses to reach out to her after that. Every moment with her was awkward and on edge. She'd ask me things like,
"How do you know you aren't just a brain in a vat and I'm toying with you about everything?"
Have you ever spent time alone with someone you feel has the potential to be dangerous or could mean to do you harm, you're just not sure? I didn't believe Esther wanted to harm me. I just had that feeling around her, that nervous feeling that she could snap at any moment. A few years after she'd returned, she contacted me sounding more lucid than she had in a long time.
"Listen to me. I didn't put everything in the book. There was more."
Why would you have to hide anything?
"Just listen. The tribe didn't remember me as me. They remembered me in a very specific role. They wove me into their founding legend. I was one of the two beings that stepped from the mists and claimed the land as their own, driving out their enemies. They even ascribed some significance to my infinity pendant."
So, they make up history. It's what a whole chunk of your book was about.
"I didn't bring my pendant with me, Jack. It was a turning point. That's when I started to believe them. That's not really the best way to put it. It wasn't belief. You don't have to believe in facts. That's when I started actually remembering the events they told me about. It became part of my history. But I'm still a logical woman. Logically, both my remembered realities can't be true. Which Esther am I, Jack?"
I don't think South American mist people are as fond of iced caramel macchiatos as you are.
Always so glib. The things I remembered were incredible. The mist, the place so deep in the wilderness it's beyond place.
We grew further and further apart, as my conversations with her generally went through similar twists. Truthfully, the new Esther gave me the creeps, and we made very few new memories together. Going back. 20 years after her first voyage, she decided she had to go back. Even though I hadn't heard from her in years, she contacted me to let me know this. Apprehension was the first thing I felt. I knew what the first trip had done to her, but I was so disgusted with the way she'd turned her back on everyone, I told her, "Do what you want." All I had to do was tell her, "Don't go." I failed her. I think back to the dream and wonder if that's what it meant. Even after all that time, her announcement that she would revisit the tribe was a big deal in the anthropological community. She spun it as a follow-up, testing the theories and observations she put forward in her book. For those who had accused her of not being scientific enough, she answered,
"This is how anthropological science is done. It's slow, methodical, spans decades."
It was only after all the hullabaloo and near her departure date that I paid her a visit in person and pleaded with her not to go. I was too late. "You'll lose yourself there."
"That's been done. I plan to find what I lost."
I told her that although I wasn't the sort of person to have feelings and intuitions, as she well knew, I felt reasonably certain I'd never see her again. She said she felt the same way. In the year that went by after her departure, I thought about her a lot. Yes, I wondered if she was all right, if she did find herself, if she was banging out a new book that would be as controversial as the first. It was more than that, though. I thought about her involuntarily. I'd begun having spontaneous dreams again. New ones. Dreams of her stepping from a dark fog. I was instinctively terrified of her in the dreams. I made the association it was the same pit in the woods, only darker now. Was she the same figure? Others were there and they were panicking, and someone whispered to me, "This is where it begins." I found myself questioning the integrity of my memories of her right about then. You understand what I mean by second-order memory, right? Memories of memories? I could remember previously remembering some memories I had of her. Others I couldn't remember ever having remembered before. It's as though they just showed up in my mind. I was tending to my tomato plants the first time I asked myself, who is she really? And I realized I didn't know. In one of those memories, Esther was telling me,
"Of course, I could have been created just yesterday with all these memories. You know, all of our memories, thoughts, personality is entirely woven into the matter of the brain, right? It's all physical. If not, we have to admit there's something like a soul. A soul is a terrible thing, because it's not in the casual chain of existence. It's something else. How did Sartre put it? Nothing secreting nothingness."
I said something like, "I don't know, I've never read Sartre." And she told me I made a point of reading Sartre every day.
Don't be foolish.
I really have never read any Sartre, though. So where would this memory come from if not from her actually talking about Sartre, except I know this never happened. I know because in the memory, we were children and she was telling me all this stuff from a hole the size of a grapefruit in my living room floor. I have another memory that I went looking for her in Brazil because she should have been back a long time by then. However, there's no record on my passport or my credit cards that this flight ever happened. I just remember it so well, in such detail. In the memory, I brought along 2 mutual friends, one of whom was from the linguistics department, so he could help me with communication. We met up with some of Esther's local contacts. They remembered her. They told us she'd asked for some guide to take her deeper into the forest. She had to go deeper, she told them. They told her it was too dangerous and that there was nothing out there anyway. She told them,
"Nothing is what I'm looking for."
They remembered her saying that because she looked as crazy as she sounded. She told them that she had to see the Purple Church. She showed them some satellite images where a part of the forest was always blurry. The guide said that spot was so deep there weren't even any trails for miles. She wouldn't listen when they told her there were no buildings in there at all. I described the village then, and the guide was able and willing to take us there. The people of the village were suspicious of us, but not hostile. We showed them a picture of Esther and asked if they'd seen her. They said they'd never seen her. Why would they lie? I thought about the conversation Esther and I had once, and it hit me. I asked instead if they'd seen anyone who resembled the picture. They brought us to a hut on the outskirts of the village. Our guide interpreted for the villagers, telling us that she had been cast out to this hut and that she had been living there for a while. Then she was gone. We searched the few possessions left in her hut. They were strange. A picture of a boy I'd never seen before, but somehow knew was a missing child. A Betty Boop figure. Some newspaper clippings about immigration. It was all random junk except for a bundle of short letters written on scraps. We found them hidden under her pallet. They were all addressed to me. Letter 1.
An awful thing has happened since I left them. I have to figure it out. They behave as though nothing's changed, but everything has. Paul oppresses the tribe's villages. So much so, these are barely the same villages. Either through inability or unwillingness, they won't acknowledge that they've been afflicted. The signs of disaster are everywhere in the settlement. The signs of hidden misery in their faces. They can barely make eye contact. I've begun interrogating them whenever I can get one alone to find out what it was. They have the memories locked somewhere in their brains. If I can get them to refer to personal memory over social memory, I can get a real answer. I'm starting to feel like a real anthropologist again.
Letter 2.
I found the old man with the fish tattoo. He denied that I had been gone for 20 years, or at all. He swore by it. That wasn't the part that disturbed me. It was this. He told me another tribe from deeper in the forest had been surrounding the village. They would come at night, without lights, and stay there until dawn. They stayed where it was perfect dark, so they were invisible. The keenest in the villages could hear them. Everyone could sense them, standing in the dark, watching the whole night. Who were they? He didn't know. There shouldn't be any tribes they don't know.
Letter 3.
I started remembering. I remembered the mist, but not like I remembered it before. It was so frightening, Jack. It's like a time traveler's paradox. If the time traveler changes an event in the past, does he remember the two contradictory events? If so, his memory, his reality, is a different order of reality, flowing above the other. I have my memory of the mist as it was 20 years ago, stepping out of the light. And I have this memory of the mist now and its nothingness between the substances, this space of pure resentment against all that exists and coheres.
Letter 4.
I stay on the outskirts of the village because they're afraid of me now. When I walk through the village, they mostly scatter. I see drawings in the soil of a snake-haired lady hovering over sleeping figures. Sometimes she was stepping out of a portal of some kind. I tried to ask about the drawings, but none would answer. I cornered a hunter and asked him why they were the only two villagers now. He said that's how it's always been. When the king's son died, they made towns around the grave to keep them at peace. What about the third? I asked. He said the third didn't stay dead and had no peace.
Letter 5.
I found out why they are such a morbid people now. I know why their thoughts are of death and decay and danger. I told them why. It's because they are the ghosts of the people I met so long ago. They don't exist. They're my memories of the people, and I've changed. I was going to cut one to prove it, but they forced me back to my shelter.
Letter 6.
A boy with testicular fortitude threw a rock at me today. He said I should go back to the pit I came from, and he wouldn't let me change his family like I changed the others. I was going to ask him what he meant. Then I remembered something. I remembered coming from the place deep in the forest, the deepest point. I had to go back there. I told him I'd go if he'd take me.
That was it. I asked the guide if we could go back there. He said there was no way. Even the tribes don't venture there. I had him ask the tribe for the boy mentioned in the letters. He said no boy of their tribe would go there. The boy did not exist. I remembered all of these events in such detail. The friends I supposedly gone with thought I was pranking them when I asked if they remembered. They said I was being ridiculous. Of course, we never went to Brazil. Why would we? They asked. So I decided to go to Brazil for real, and I went alone. Letting go. In real life, I didn't know Esther's contacts in Brazil. I'd gone through her notes and any communication she'd ever sent me. There was nothing. So I made the rounds, asking any guides if they'd seen her. I asked them if they knew what tribe it could be. Most of them had no idea. None of them had seen her. One guide said he knew the tribe I meant, but he had never seen her. I asked him if he knew of a church deep in the woods or a hole. He said, "Whoever told you that is no friend of yours." He took me to see the tribe. In my memory, it was a breeze getting from the city to the deep forest. This was not a breeze. The air was horribly humid, insects were everywhere, and the terrain made any vehicular assistance impossible. I kept reminding myself this was for Esther. When at last we reached the tribe's land, we were not exactly welcome. They had weapons drawn on us immediately. The guide explained our purpose. He said they had never seen any white woman, and certainly had never allowed one to live amongst them. I asked if they had years ago. I tried to explain how she'd written a whole book on them. The guide shook his head and communicated my message as best he could. 2 of the tribesmen went into the foliage. "Just wait," my guide said. They returned minutes later with an old man. He talked animatedly for a moment. My guide told me, He said he took a woman into the forest when he was a boy. She told him someone else would be coming. He's offering to take you. I don't think you should go, sir. Ask him if he knows who came out of the mist, I told him. He seemed reluctant, but he did as I asked. The old man seemed less animated speaking this time. The guide told me, lies. On the way to the airport, I thought I saw her in a coffee shop, just reading and sipping coffee. I told myself I was just tired. I was seeing her everywhere. I let it go. I let her go. Weeks later, I decided it was time to finish the grieving process. My mother had died a few years ago. I still had all of her stuff in storage. That included photo albums. I dug them all out and flipped through photo after photo, remembering good times and awkward ones. There were no bad times. They only feel bad when you're that age. Then I hit the days when those memories should be with Esther. I couldn't find a single photo of her. Just like my family, I thought to myself, always taking pictures at the wrong time. But it was alarmingly consistent. She wasn't in any picture. I flipped ahead to prom. Some other girl was holding my arm. I recognized her. Mary Elizabeth Riley. I barely knew her. I put the albums away. I suppose I could have had recourse to other material. Letters, any journals I'd kept, if any, but again, I let it go. I realized I didn't know exactly when Esther had come into my life. I had all these memories and I don't know when they were created. They're slowly fading, which is why I felt the need to record all of this now. I don't know what her endgame was. What would have happened to me had I gone deeper? Oblivion, I think. I was suddenly very glad she was gone. Esther, you've had an experience. It changed you, but you're still you. And as your one-man intervention, I'll love you through this.
What about whales?
She asked. NANI? Whatever sound a pure question mark is, that's the one I made.